From the California State Senate, this is Senate Spotlight. Welcome to this edition of Senate Spotlight, where we discuss legislative priorities and policy and other related issues with members of the California State Senate. From the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green, and joining us this time around for this segment is Senator Ted Lieu, representing the 28th Senate District down on the coast, Los Angeles, Carson, El Segundo, Hermosa Beach, Torrance. I know I'm missing several hamlets in there, and also the chair of the Senate Labor and Industrial Relations Committee. Senator Lieu, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Honored to be here. And actually, with my new district, I now will get Palos Verdes, Peninsula, Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, Pacific Palisades, and
wow, so you have the whole
Angeles.
South Coast and inland in there.
Yes.
That's terrific. Well, great. Well, welcome, and glad to have you here and representing your constituents. Let's talk about this new legislative year for 2013. Last year, 2012, a Democratic supermajority, and I'm asking a lot of your other colleagues about this too. More Democrats in the Senate and the Assembly right now. What does that mean to governing and legislating here in California this session?
Well, I think what the public is interested in are results and good governance. So to me, it shouldn't matter whether an idea is a Democratic idea or a Republican idea. If it's a good proposal, we should adopt it and go forward. And we've frankly had very good results over the last few years because of our fiscal restraint, because of the job creation measures we put in. We now have a budget surplus predicted for next year for the first time in about a decade. We have a balanced budget this year, and things are looking good. We've had 16 months of straight job creation in California. And our credit rating has gone from negative under Governor Schwarzenegger to stable under Governor Brown to now positive.
And actually, you give me a great segue here into talking about the budget. This year's budget, as like you say, for the first time in definitely a decade, one could even say maybe a generation, we've seen this budget that's pretty neutral, that no deficit, nice surplus, but at the same time there are still going to be some cuts proposed, and I know you and your Democratic colleagues are going to look at that closely.
Yes, and there are still some risks. We have their uncertainty in Washington, D.C. The economy is still slowly starting to improve, but you never know. It could start on a downturn, so that's why we have to continue efforts to grow our economy. And my view of how we succeed in California is not by making socks. Our land value is too expensive, our cost of living is too high. It's going to be in those areas where we have a competitive advantage, right? Things we can do better than other states or other countries. So when you look at our economy, about 70% is driven in 15 or so different industry sectors. Mm-hmm. So we've got a very robust high-tech sector. We have biotech, we've got agriculture, mm-hmm. right? 80% of the strawberries consumed in the U.S. come from California. We have ports. Idaho is never going to have a deep water port, right? Mm-hmm. Switzerland will never have a deep water port. We have an entertainment complex that's hard to replicate. And so if we can incentivize these industries where we can do well, I believe that's how we succeed in California. It's called a sector strategies approach, and I've been trying to get California to move in that direction.
And in fact, you have legislation you're just introducing hot off the presses here, Senate Bill 118, that attempts to do this, I guess, in cooperation with the California Workforce Investment Board. Tell us about that.
Yes, so I held a workforce hearing several years ago, and it was clear to me there is a misalignment between what employers need and the skills that workers actually have. So Raytheon Corporation testified, and they said something interesting. They said their CEO does not lose sleep at night because of increased regulations. He loses sleep because he couldn't fill his open positions. And Boeing testified that at the time they had, on any given day, dozens of open positions available. And they weren't even looking, for a rocket scientist. They just wanted someone who had a 2-year technical degree after high school that they could hire to help manufacture and assemble planes. So if we could get the workforce more aligned with what employers need, I believe that's how we succeed. My bill is a step along that path. I'm also excited. Last year, the governor signed a bill of mine that increased, extended, and changed the Economic Workforce and Development Program, which provides grants by putting together stakeholders of business and labor and community groups to fund organizations to train people for skills that they need. And if we can continue doing these strategies, I believe that's how we succeed in California.
And indeed, California and the nation saw this coming over the last decade or so, right? I mean, we've been poised for this change as we lost defense industry funding and our agrarian labor folks were not responding to that, to the economy difficulties, and people all of a sudden were not trained for this new workforce of the new millennium.
Correct. And so one of the things we also did is we have this whole system of workforce investment boards, state one plus local ones. And it used to be that, let's say you lost a clerical job. What they would try to do is put you into another low-wage clerical job. My view is that doesn't really advance the ball very far. So instead, we mandated through my committee last year, I'm chair of the Labor Industrial Relations Committee, that instead of doing that, we're going to set aside 25% of the funds to retrain this person into a skill set that they can actually use for the 21st century economy, because we're not going to get certain segments back of our economy. So low-wage manufacturing is not going to happen in California. Vietnam is simply going to be able to make socks cheaper than we ever can. And so we just have to stop competing in those industries where we can't compete and start incentivizing the ones that we can. And the one factor that is in virtually all these industries is that it requires some sort of higher education. And I think it's very important that we start refunding our UCs, our CSUs, our community colleges. I'm very pleased with the current budget proposal, which does increase funding to higher education, as well as to K through 12 education, because that's our key to our future.
And that really is the gateway, isn't it? I mean, to seeing a more competitive workforce in the next generation is the changes now.
Absolutely. We're simply not going to, again, compete with having a whole mass of high school graduates with nothing beyond that. So we've got to get people to have skill sets beyond a high school diploma, where they can work and have a good, decent job and support a family. And that's how we grow our economy and how we succeed in California.
Great. Well, we talked about Senate Bill 118, which is one of your latest bills that you're introducing. Let's talk about some of your other legislative agenda for this new year. This week, as we speak, President Obama, as promised, began this broad campaign to fight gun violence, including more help for schools, including developing emergency preparedness plans and training for active shooters on campus. And this is prompting you to reintroduce a piece of legislation this year that addresses school safety, not just on the active shooter element, but on a broader way, natural disasters. First, just for the sake of discussion, what is active shooter? I mean, we can all assume, but explain that, and then just describe your bill to us.
So I also happen to be in the Air Force Reserves, and we actually have various exercises, and many federal installations have active shooter exercises where they simulate someone on the grounds of their installation who has a gun and is trying to kill people. And so you simulate the exercise, and you're told things that you should do and shouldn't do. It just strikes me that we need to have a lot more facilities start doing this, including schools. And you know, the Newtown tragedy really brings that home. And there are lots of things that you may not think about when your adrenaline is pumping, when actually emergency is happening. If you don't practice this or train this beforehand, you may not know exactly what to do. When I was in assembly, I found something very disturbing. A lot of schools simply didn't have any school safety plans, or their safety plans were not updated. When I first introduced my bill in assembly, LAUSD, their high schools had 50% of them not having school safety plans. Hopefully that has gotten better, and my sense is it has. But if you ask the question right now, which schools in the state have school safety plans, no one knows the answer. So my bill will address that. It will make schools affirmatively report that they have a school safety plan. It will make them affirmatively deal with the active shooter scenario. It also gives a superintendent of public instruction the ability to withhold some funding from schools who don't have school safety plans.
That's the interesting element of this, the carrot and stick approach here, is withholding the funding, and also sort of an accountability, putting them on, I don't want to call it public humiliation, but putting them on a hot list if their school or their district doesn't come up with this plan.
Well, that's correct, because right now there is no consequence. There already is a law that says schools have to do school safety plans. Some schools, or perhaps many, we just don't know, are not complying because there is zero consequence, and my bill is an enforcement mechanism to do that. It's in line with President Obama's executive action, where he called for increased funding for training for schools, for emergency preparedness, as well as developing model emergency preparedness plans. And I'm very, very supportive of both what's he trying to do with doing schools nationwide, and it's important we do it in California as well.
And I suspect schools are going to come to you, especially in light of the recent news headlines, and obviously be a little more compliant, if you will, in following the mandates of this bill based on what's happened.
I would hope so, and as President Obama has said, taking care of our children is our first task. And when parents drop their children off at public school in California, the state is essentially acting in loco parentis. We're acting as their caretaker for those children, and we better make darn sure they're as safe as possible. And I myself have a personal conflict of interest. I've got two kids, a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old that go to public school in California, and I want them to be as safe as possible.
Well, I think that's a good conflict of interest that's good to have in this particular case. One other piece of your legislation here for 2013 is SB 57, making it a felony for parolees to cut off their GPS-aided ankle bracelets. We've heard of this kind of thing before, but I sense that this is a much more serious problem than we are led to suspect.
So approximately 2 years ago, we had about 173 felons who cut off their GPS ankle bracelets. The year after, it jumped up to nearly 300. That's over a 60% increase. And the reason is there was a change in the law. It used to be that they cut off their GPS ankle bracelet, they would be sent back to prison for 1 year. Pretty hefty penalty. Now, they don't get sent back to prison, and the maximum punishment is 6 months in county jail. Some county jails weren't even booking them when they did this violation. Some keep them for only a few days or a few weeks because of overcrowding at the local jails. And so we need to reinstitute the penalty we had before. This will actually reduce state prison overcrowding because most of these offenders are sex offenders who have to wear GPS ankle bracelets, and studies show that they will recidivate less if they know they're being monitored. And so it's important that we keep these ankle bracelets on these dangerous sex offenders, and what my bill does will help enforce that penalty.
And there is kind of a direct correlation to some degree, I think you found out, between what's gone on with realignment and the burdens, if you will, on the counties and the result of this problem, right?
Yeah, so realignment has generally worked quite well. We've been able to reduce our prison overcrowding. We've been able to not put people in jail who really shouldn't be there state prison, right? Your drug users and nonviolent offenders. But there are some unintended consequences. This GPS ankle bracelet issue, I think, is something that people didn't intend, and I'm trying to fix it.
Right. One of the other pieces of legislation is SB 50, the Payphone Fairness Bill, which again, coming up with something you don't consider as being top of the line problem, but it is indeed an issue involving mandatory signage on the payphones, warning credit and debit card users that they may get really taken to the cleaners here with this phone call. Why this bill? Cell phones are so ubiquitous nowadays. Why are we worried about the payphones? Like
so one of my passions has always been consumer protection. And it really bothers me when consumers are ripped off. So oftentimes, or I should say oftentimes, sometimes people need to use payphones because their cell phone died, or because it's the only thing available because their cell phone is out of range. Let's say you're driving in a remote highway area, or you're at an airport and you just don't have your cell phone for whatever reason. Well, when you go to a payphone, it will say, for example, 50 cents for a local call. Well, it doesn't tell you that if you use a credit card to pay for it, they could charge whatever amount they want. So a constituent of mine was actually charged $20 for a 20-second phone call. And my bill is pretty simple. It requires a payphone to require a disclosure that says if you pay with a credit card, it could be whatever amount it is. And that will at least give the consumer the ability to say, you know, I'm going to go buy a cup of coffee, get my 50-cent change, and make the call instead of paying $20 for a 20-second phone call.
Fascinating. Interesting legislation here for 2013.
Thank
Before
you.
we wrap here, I'm going to take you back to 2012. One of your pieces of legislation that was signed last year had to do with the so-called reparative therapy, making California the first state in the nation to end sexual orientation change therapies. We've heard a lot about this as we ended last year and gone into this new year. You had two separate legal challenges, one that I says affirmed the bill and one that would have put a stay on it. As we speak now here in the early part of 2013, what's the status of this mandate?
Well, so let me just give a little background. 10 major professional health organizations have rejected reparative therapy, also known as gay conversion therapy, because sexual orientation is not a mental defect or disease that requires any sort of cure. And what reparative therapists are doing when they try to convert someone from gay to straight, they're essentially misdiagnosing them and committing medical malpractice. And what my bill does, it says you cannot do reparative therapy on minors under 18 because they're particularly susceptible to this kind of psychological abuse. And the American Psychiatric Association, as well as the American Psychological Association, has said if you go through this therapy, you could get symptoms such as guilt, depression, suicidal ideation, self-hatred, a whole range of mental trauma, and some kids have committed suicide going through it. So my bill, first in the nation, to ban this therapy, it was upheld by one federal district court. It was put on an injunction by another federal district court, but only to 3 plaintiffs. Ninth Circuit looked at this and said, okay, we'll decide this issue. The hearing will be in April of this year. And I'm confident Ninth Circuit will reach the right result, which is you cannot continue psychological abuse of children, and I am confident they'll uphold the law.
Well, history making here in California. We will watch and see what happens with that ruling and your bill here in this year. And we have, as usual, just barely scratched the surface on so much here, but I hope we can have you back here within the next few months, maybe to go into more of the weeds on some of these other bills. So thank you for your time very much.
Thank you.
Our guest, State Senator Ted Lieu from the 28th Senate District down in Southern California. And that wraps up this edition of Senate Spotlight. We ask you to join us next time around as we discuss important legislative issues and policy with the newsmakers and newsbreakers of the California State Senate. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching Senate Spotlight.